Does Star Wars have to be serious to be good? And in general, is a science fiction or fantasy book only as good as it is serious and deals with serious, hard edge topics and, doesn't have a lot of that silly, fluffy magic stuff around there or those silly, fluffy aliens, but talks about humans and people and the real thing? Yes, this is probably a can of worms that I could have chosen not to open, but you know me, I'm going straight for that, especially as I just dropped my big, long, unfiltered current events episode for my paid subscribers on my author culture Substack. And I'm giving y'all a bit of a snippet of that, a little portion of that. If you want the full thing with all of the different articles I covered, please hop over and become a Substack paid subscriber for just $5 a month. You support what we do at Author Culture and how we help science fiction and fantasy authors like you find your unique success in a chaotic publishing world. Would super appreciate that. But I love giving little sneak peeks out here. And so I'm pulling out one of the juicy parts of that and talking about it in today's quick episode. And that is talking about seriousness versus pulpiness versus silliness in science fiction and fantasy world building, especially as it relates to the TV show Andor and its popularity with critics and its popularity with fans and its popularity for its very serious content and really getting to the serious aspects of things and what that means for how we perceive science fiction and fantasy stories. This is Janeen Ippolito of Author Culture. Let's chat. So I've been watching the latest season of the TV show Andor with my husband, and we've loved the first season. So when the second season came out, it was quickly on our list of, you don't get to watch this without me because I don't want you getting spoilers that I don't get. I don't want you getting ahead of it. And so we're making the time to watch it together, and I've been enjoying it. But at the end of the latest episode, I was kind of like, man, are they just ripping off World War II? And we went back and forth with him noting that, a lot of different TV shows, especially science fiction and fantasy, will pay homage to things like World War II and they'll draw inspiration from history. But at the same time, this episode was just so gritty and so bleak and so lacking in any kind of presence of aliens or anything really fantastical. It just felt like a bunch of made up worlds that all sit in for countries, basically, because it's this whole world, but we only see this one little section that basically stands in for, oh, you're Switzerland, only you're weird Switzerland that has some fashion choices that are vaguely Japanese. That kind of sort of made up cultural worlds and made up politics that harken back to history, but there's not a lot of that deeper, juicier world building that I'm looking for. It's really easy to peel things back and go, ooh, I know where that came from. And I wasn't expecting that because it's Star Wars and I do like the unique world building. I used to sit down as a kid with those big world building books and Bibles and just like flip through and, look at the different customs and cultures they made up for different things. And of course, the different stuff with the Force, I thought it was interesting. So I just noticed how toned down it was in Andor, especially in this particular season. And then I checked online and I was like, wow, this season is going through the roof with rankings. Critics are loving it. It is a critics' darling here. And one of the things that critics are saying and applauding is it's so much more humane. It's so much, more real life and grounded. And my first slightly sarcastic thought was, I don't know where you guys live, but I live in a place with color, which was a slight jab at the fact that the stylistic visual tone of the series is very much monochromatic color schemes and muted schemes to kind of create that particular mood. And so people are saying it's very, very realistic. And I'm like, I don't walk outside my door and almost to get shot. That's not my reality. The idea is that people are saying they're connecting more with this kind of real human story. And my first thought is that because it's like World War II when a lot of people just find World War II fascinating? Or is this also saying something deeper about how we perceive science fiction and fantasy world building and what we just as an author culture, as a publishing industry culture, as a science fiction and fantasy culture, what we consider high art versus low art. And so, for all that science fiction and fantasy allows us to create truly unique and interesting fantasy and science fiction worlds, are people still getting honored and elevated for not taking advantage of that and for making things more realistic and less creative? It was an interesting thing to consider. And so I hopped over to some articles. And so if you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to see me looking off to the side here, which is where my second screen is. And I found some interesting articles about Andor and particularly commenting on this perspective. So this one article on Screen Rant said, Episode 8 of Andor in particular felt like such an elevated version of Star Wars, maintaining the core themes and foci of the Star Wars universe, but taking itself much more seriously than is typical in the franchise. And this seriousness is considered an asset by this critic. Finally, we're taking things seriously. And they go on to write, this is particularly pivotal for this show, which aims to represent what these events were like for the people on the ground, especially those who possessed no incredible power or famous lineage. So they're automatically creating this dichotomy where it's like if you have any kind of power or famous lineage, you're ultimately up here like a godlike thing and we can't really connect with you. Whereas if you're down here in the dirt and life is hard and there's much suffering all the time, we can relate to you. And I thought that made an interesting idea that we can only connect to other people through suffering. Is that what they're saying? Are we saying that while you can create unique story worlds, no one really connects with that, dial it down and be serious already, and that's how we do it? Now, often this is sort of a bias that critics can have, the same way that you don't often see comedies win the Oscars or other awards because everyone assumes the really serious, dramatic movies are in some way better or more elevated, even though it's been shown over and over again that comedy work takes just as much effort to write and just as much effort to act. But it's a bias in the culture, this is author culture, so this is what we're talking about. But it is interesting how this is showing up in Andor. And conversely, as someone who, I like history, I enjoy history, I have gone to so many World War II museums and other military museums. I was a military brat. My parents got discounts. We went to all the stuff. So I'm familiar with that. But I was just wondering, do we need to siphon off all of the magic and all of the uniqueness and make something super close to, in this case, World War II, for it to be high art? Is that what we're doing in science fiction and fantasy? Just something to consider there. Now, if we're hopping over to this article on vulture.com, conversely, they actually pointed out the lack of aliens in Andor, which I thought was interesting as well. They're offering a different perspective. They're saying the Empire itself has always been depicted as human-driven, presuming some kind of disdain for other types of creatures as lower in some way. So fair enough that the showrunner Krennic isn't dying to give proper credit to all these different aliens that were sort of involved in the Empire's creation of the Death Star, like the Geonosians. The article goes on to say, however, but it also feels like Tony Gilroy and company, hoping to be taken as seriously as possible, are just as eager to scrub those kind of characters, those alien characters, from their series, relegating them to bit parts whenever possible. So the story spends a fair amount of time on this planet called Gorman, a planet whose economy depends on spider-produced twill, and yet we don't see much of the spiders. We don't see any of that really interesting world building and what the webs look like. And in fact, the webs just look like someone took a bunch of webbing and just dumped it all over and said, look, we have webs. There's just very little care put into that. They note that Coruscant 2 looks a lot more human heavier than it did in the prequel films. And you just see this lack of Andor using the world building that was created. And the article finally points out that this might feel like an odd complaint for an episode that is by and large well up to the high standards of Andor, but it does sometimes feel as if Gilroy and company are ignoring a very particular aspect of Star Wars, not necessarily for thematic reasons, but for aesthetic ones. A classic Empire move, I might say. So it's an interesting choice that you wonder, are they downplaying the aliens and anything really fantastical about the Star Wars world building so they can appeal more to thriller fans and historical thriller fans and historical spy thriller fans who may not have time for that stuff? Or so they can appeal to hard science fiction fans who are also noticeably a little more hard edged towards any of that silly and plausible alien stuff. And it just made me wonder where things are going in terms of intricate and creative world building versus more grounded or realistic world building in the science fiction and fantasy reading culture. I've already mentioned how things like cozy fantasy are, in their own way, making things a little more grounded, although cozy fantasy is more about everyday moments, and it's also more about safety in terms of the plot line as well. Cozy is not high stakes. These are things that people are going to read after a long day, or maybe dealing with very high stakes situations, and they're going to kind of wrap that cozy plot around themselves like a blanket and relax. Versus this idea of high and low fantasy, and this idea of hard and soft sci-fi, and hard sci-fi and maybe low fantasy being taken more seriously is just an interesting way to consider the story medium. And I know this is like an ongoing thing where you see debates between people who are more fans of hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi. You know, hard sci-fi says, ugh, that's so unrealistic and silly. Soft sci-fi says it's actually creative and unique and ingenuous, and also you don't get to have our laser swords, thank you very much. So these aren't new debates, but with the success of Andor and the lack of success that has happened with Disney's other ventures, I wonder if that's going to keep them going towards doing more hard-edge science fiction stories rather than doing more fantastical stories. And I'm not dissing stories that are deeper or grittier or hard edge or explore trauma. I get that. There is a place for that. And those things often do win awards and often are seen as more serious because they go to those dark places. And that's fair. But I'm just interested in how that can play into world building and the choices people make and the ways that we can be missing out on the fantastical because it has to be intense or deep or gritty. Or conversely, whether this is an example of things getting more polarized. So the only options you have for writing things are deep and gritty and trauma laden and emotional and the real thing, or super clean and squeaky and fluffy and cozy. And sometimes you do see the trauma stuff coming over into clean fiction a little bit. And they'll say, you know, it's clean and squeaky, but it's also dark and a little bit traumatic because I find that adds depth. But where is the place for the humor or the sarcasm or the satire and finding joy in light moments as well as just having to survive and suffer through dark ones? Where is that balance? Is there a place for balanced fiction that has both of those things? And to bring in something else here, a movie that I really enjoyed recently that is going to be talked about in a future live stream with the amazing Amy C. Williams is Thunderbolts. And I really enjoyed this Marvel movie, really well done. And what I thought it did well in particular was balancing the light moments with the dark moments and the hard moments in it. And I was listening to another critique person, and they were like, yeah, I would have liked it if it was even more serious. And I'm going, did you see the stuff they were going through? And you just wanted to just go super deep into that and not have any moments of levity? How do you survive your life? And that could just be my personality. I get it. And there is definitely place for things that are more tonally focused on one area and tonally focused in another area. I'm not saying everything has to be super salty and sweet and sour and savory and all those flavors at the same time, all the time. But in terms of world building, I really do hope that we continue to see world building that is also intriguing and creative and unique and different and has different things to say and playful things to say and isn't just restricted to little boxes. We'll see how it goes. I know that people are often finding that it's easier to put themselves in boxes so they're seen by other people. And I'm the first person to say, if you can fit close to a genre, please fit in that genre because it'll make your life easier. But also appreciate and understand that things that are higher adventure and exciting and unique and have a different kind of story to tell than just, life is suffering and hard or life is cozy and easy. That those stories have value too. And I hope that we're going to continue to see some books and movies that dare to keep those things together and not fall into a place where the world building itself it just becomes more polarized and more pulled apart. Because I think there should be space for all those kind of books, not just the ones that fit into a particular tonal, mood-based mold. And there's your snippet of my current events podcast. I hope that some of you will hop over and become a paid subscriber so that you support the awesome that is the Author Culture podcast. And you also do get the full-length episode, which includes some really great articles talking about how to choose wisdom in book events and one particular horror story when people ended up in a unsuccessful event that basically was a dumpster fire, some really cool new tools that authors are using to help them out, and some really interesting new trends in the world of publishing and traditional publishing models. So I'd love to see you over there as a paid subscriber, but no matter what, make sure that you do subscribe to this YouTube channel and on Substack. And I am so psyched that you're here. Your existence is fantastic. Now go forth and be awesome.